and they would talk over and discuss the affairs of earth, and they would come to some kind of a consensus, and what they said went. No, a dynasty would come on the scene if heaven wanted to come. It wasn't a personal God, it was heaven. And then the dynasty would last until heaven decided they'd had enough of this dynasty. Then they would remove that dynasty, and heaven would put another dynasty on the scene. In other words, the concept was very impersonal, as opposed to Europeans now who worship a personal God. And a lot of people believe this made a big difference in the Chinese mentality, because their concept of the other world or the other realm was very, very impersonal. And in fact, it almost seems like somewhere along the way they lost much of their religion and replaced their religion with philosophy, which is something I will be talking about in a little bit. That heaven would give them a mandate, and the mandate, what heaven decided was what went. In other words, the idea of predestination, fatalism. The Chinese had it, what will be, and our life is predetermined and preset, and there is nothing on earth we can do to change the will of heaven. And we have a lot of people in the Western world who believe this. People who believe in predestination. What's going to be is going to be. We can't change it, so why try? Now, hey, folks, I'm teaching about this stuff. Don't get the impression that I subscribe to it. And especially this, I don't. I mean, I believe humans can and should take responsibility. But they believe that humans could not take responsibility, therefore, why try? And it was one of the things that led them to get so far and then stop. Your book goes into more detail about the rights, which I'm not going to hold you responsible for. The economy, they had a well-field system, but again, don't worry too much about that. What I do want you to concern yourself with, though, is some of the other religious beliefs and their philosophies, particularly Confucius. Now, as time went on, the Chinese seemed to develop more of a chaos. So then things became chaotic. And into this scenario, Confucius was born, and he wanted to see the ancient order restored that they'd had under this former dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, and he longed for the days. But of course, the past is never going to be restored, and even if we'd find out even if it could, we wouldn't like it. Confucius' goal was to get a government job, to be an advisor to some nobleman or high up ruler. So he went around all over China, talked to noblemen, trying to get one of them to sponsor him, and none of them ever did. It is believed he may have died feeling like he was a failure. And as is the case of a lot of persons, they're elevated after they die. In their own history, the first example that comes to my mind is Abraham Lincoln. While he was alive, he was called an idiot, an imbecile, and a whole lot of other uncomplimentary terms. And when he died, nobody could praise him highly enough, and they put him on a pedestal right next to George Washington, the founder of his country, built a memorial to him, monuments, put his picture on the penny, the most circulated coin there is, and also the $5 bill. Washington, this is his picture on the one. The 5 is the second most circulated bill there is. So we couldn't elevate him highly enough. But same way with Confucius. In his lifetime, while he was going around China, he would collect disciples. We're later going to learn that Socrates did the same thing. So did Plato, so did Aristotle, and so did Jesus. These men would collect disciples and train these disciples. And there were no universities, so persons who were starved for knowledge, starved for learning, would collect around a great teacher. And Confucius was known as the great teacher. When he died, in a few years' time, just a few generations, some emperors made his teachings the official religion of their empire. And Confucianism was to remain the official religion of China from about 300 BCE until the year 1949. That was when communism took over. Now, your chapter opens up The chapter opens up with a vignette that says that the Chinese society or Chinese culture is the only civilization that has survived from ancient times to the 20th century intact. You might ask, what about Egypt? Well, Egypt changed religions. They changed first from their old paganism to Christianity, from Christianity to Islam. So Egypt, you can't say it has the same civilization. But the Chinese had the same civilization from about 300 BCE to, you can say 1905. That was the year that he deposed the last emperor and set up a republic, which didn't work. Or you can say 1949. That was the year they set up communism. But they had the same civilization. And now, after trying communism for almost 60 years, actually a little bit more than 60 years, 65 years, after trying communism, there's a lot of Chinese that said, let's go back to Confucianism, for we're better off under Confucius than we are under communism. All right, what did Confucius teach? First of all, his ideas have been called a philosophy rather than a religion. We do not know if Confucius even believed that there is a God. Again, the Chinese had almost all given up on the concept of a personal God that had a name and just said, well, heaven wills it, heaven this and heaven that, without the idea of a personal God. Confucius's teachings are lacking in any kind of spiritual depth. Very materialistic, but he dealt with man's relationship to the earth, the place where we live, particularly man's relationship to each other, to your family, to your state. He believed in hard work, in loyalty to the state, loyalty to your local community, hard work, thrift, practical. What your book calls the real aspects, not the pie in the sky, but the real aspects of daily living. Chinese would say, Confucius say, and I can't quote any Confucius saying off the top of my head. Maybe one of you can, but there's real aspects of daily living. Now, he believed that everyone had his own, now this word's going to become important in a bit. Da, sometimes spelled ta. I've seen it spelled both ways. Your book mentions it both ways, but your book prefers this one, the author. Everybody had his own da. Now, there's no real English translation of that word, but the nearest word we have in English is the word way. That everyone had his own way. So if a person did things a certain way, that was his business. Leave him alone, let him do things his way, even if that way is not your way. Now, granted, there were limits. Some people, their way is to steal everything they can get their hands on. Well, you know, that's just, no society can tolerate that indefinitely. So, in other words, not every doll, not every way was right, not every way was acceptable. He believed that people had their own doll. He believed that everybody was basically good. Therefore, he set the foundations for freedom. Now, folk, this is going to confuse you in a few minutes. And we have about 15 minutes left to cut. Because later on, his followers, a group of his followers, turned around and said that man is basically evil. And you might wonder, how could a person follow Confucius and turn around? It's the same way with all religions and all philosophies. There are always branches that will go off in one direction, and then branches who claim to be following the same religion will go off in another direction. You find it among every religion, among every peoples, and Confucius was no exception. But he believed in the basic goodness of man, and also something else he believed that Thomas Jefferson would agree with. He believed that governments existed because of the will of the people. And if a government failed to perform its function, it was the right of the people. Now here I'm quoting Jefferson. It's the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. Now I'm quoting Jefferson here, but Confucius would have said it in a different way. It said the same thing. Governments do not exist except by the will of the people. And this was a radical idea for the time. Now, there was a serious weakness, so to Confucius. It's sheer lack of anything spiritual. A mother who lost a 2-year-old child would find little comfort from the teachings of Confucius. Some religions would console you and say, hey, you're going to see your child again, or it's all going to get right in the next life, or everything will work out all right. In the case of Confucius, as far as we know, once that child died, that was the end, and this, again, very little comfort. Now, as is the case of humanity, when you have one generation who is religiously indifferent, a lot of times your children turn out to be religious fanatics. Or you have the parents who are religious fanatics, their children will turn out to be religiously indifferent. If you haven't seen that yet in your life, you probably will at some point. So Confucius spawned a reaction in another group of people called the Daoists, or Daoism. Daoism was a lot different from Confucius, and one of the differences is that it was very spiritual, very material, very much, in fact, it was so spiritual they led the Europeans to think that China was a land of magic. That they supposedly could work magic, call on the spirits. Very, very, but I'll get more in, I'm jumping ahead of myself in Daoism. Before I get to Daoism, though, your book jumps to some of Confucius' followers. A group of people called the legalists. Now, if you think I'm in a hurry, I am, folk, because I got about 40 minutes behind. Anyway, legalism. Legalism says that man is basically evil, and it's up to the government to rule by fear. In other words, make a person afraid to commit a crime because they fear the severity of the punishment if they committed that crime. This was not what Confucius taught, but the persons used his teachings to come to that conclusion. And again, you can come to any conclusion, any teaching, folk, I mean, if you try to enough. Essentially, they were saying that since Confucius taught us the practical way of living, the government should hold a club over everybody and say, either straighten up, behave, or I'll clobber you good. Now, legalism has appeared in many forms all over the world. Every religion has its legalistic people. All right, now, I might not should, but I'm going to, on a personal note, I grew up under legalism. Now, under legalism, you're always under condemnation and always judged. And you're always wrong and you're always bad. And I was asked by one class a few years ago, when you were an elementary school teacher, were you a legalist? I'm afraid I was. Of course, being in elementary school, I don't know how I can be anything else much anymore. But I did not get married until I was 39, and I had 3 children. One of the biggest compliments one of my children paid to me one day was one of them said, "We don't have any rules around here in this house." I'm thinking, well, is that a compliment or not? Well, actually, I think I abide by a whole lot of life's rules, but it's because I choose to, not because I'm forced to. I mean, 2 men were told by their boss they needed to stay over and work over. Both men got on the phone and called their wives to tell them they would be late. The one man called because he wanted to. The other man called because he knew he had to. There's a huge difference, folks. And all of you, I think, know the difference. Those of you who choose not to drink, do you choose it because you're afraid that somebody's going to judge you, or do you choose because you think, hey, that's a better way of living? I mean, there's a difference, folks. Under legalism, you fear the wrath. Well, maybe you fear the wrath of the gods, you fear the wrath of the king, or the wrath of the government, or the wrath of your... There's no liberty. There's no freedom. China had a legalistic dynasty that only lasted about 21 years. The Qin dynasty, the Qin dynasty started out with one man, and he lasted about 21 years. Actually, it was 15 years, 221 to 206 BCE. The people, after a while, and this is what people do under legalism, after a while they just can't stand one any better. All right. So much for legalism, now to Taoism. The book shows a carving, maybe the Chinese, where the Confucius met the founder of Taoism, and the two men disagreed on everything, according to the story, and they couldn't understand each other. Then the founder of Taoism went his way and was never seen again, but his writings were left behind, and his followers took his writings. We do not actually know if this kind of meeting ever took place. Some of the times these men spawn spurious stories. Lao Tzu is the founder of Taoism. Don't worry about the name. Taoism, again, I've already mentioned how it was a very spiritual religion, and so much so that its followers tended to practice what we would call magic. They called it science. Our science today would definitely not call it science. But it was a reaction against the extreme materialism of Confucius, among other things. It gave Chinese people an alternative. If you want to believe in spirituality, you can become a Taoist. Taoism also was more individualistic. Confucianism lapsed into legalism. Not that Confucius himself wanted to, but Taoism said each individual can go his own way. And in fact, Taoism is difficult to define because your book gives two opening statements. One of them is, we are not the ultimate Tao, and some other else that defines what they're not. Well, you know, when a religion opens up with two statements that defines what they're not, it becomes difficult to define what they are, and maybe they didn't know what they were. All right, I will say this. About 30 years ago, I would every 5 or 6 months receive a letter from Taoists inviting me to join. And they told about this place in Tibet. You go to this monastery in Tibet, and you meet these young men who are in their early 20s, and they're very, very young looking. You talk to them, you learn that they're actually about 120 or 130 years old. I asked a Chinese man about this one time. He said, yeah, the problem is you can never tell. They have no documentation to prove when they were actually born. And you can't tell when they were actually born. But they claim to be 120 and 30 years old, and they claim that you can reverse the aging process by proper meditation and proper sexual technique. And you can live for maybe an indefinite time, depending again on how well you master the techniques. Today's doctors, today's scientists do not accept this as being factual, and their claims cannot actually be substantiated. Now, if any of you know any different or have heard any different, you're welcome. Yeah. What's that? Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, like, like we learned in I forgot which class, but basically, like, stress, like, screws with your, like, internal, what is it, the sympathetic nervous system,
yeah.
And it can actually, like, kill you, like, earlier in life. And, like,
oh, yes.
They proved that meditation can
actually, like, meditation is taught by Christianity, among other things. Yes, it is.
And by meditation, I just mean just conscious breathing.
Constant, hard breathing, yoga, whatever. This is known to have a relaxing effect. Maybe some people call it a cleansing effect. I mean, hey, I'm not pushing it or advocating it, but again, a lot of people have believed this down through the ages. All right. Again, people who did not like the rigidness of Confucianism could find some, not just more spirituality, but more freedom also. Again, the word Tao means way, Taoism. You have your own way, you choose your own way, choose your own path, much more than Confucius taught. All right. I am going to have more to say about China's beliefs later, but moving on, the first Chinese empire your book gives credit for is the dynasty known as the Qin. That's spelled Q-I-N, but if I'm not mistaken, it's pronounced Qin. If anyone wants to correct me on it, Q-I-N. Anyway, the Qin dynasty, don't worry about the name. Again, now later on in the next chapter, we'll ask you to learn the name of at least one of the dynasties, but these earlier dynasties, we'll skip over these names of the dynasties for right now. The Qin dynasty, again, was a very, very extremely legalistic dynasty. The ruler, the founding ruler, I believe they only had one ruler. The first ruler was also the last. He started off great, like he was going somewhere. People liked him. Then they got to rebelling against him. I want to say this about some people, rulers that we Americans think of, those of us who are Americans, think they very, very cruel. Joseph Stalin was liked by his own people. Now, folk, about 5 months ago, I was talking about how evil Saddam Hussein was. And one of the young ladies in the class asked, but has Iraq been better off since Saddam Hussein died? And guess what, folk? I had to give an answer that I didn't want to give. And all of you might know what answer I had to give. Iraq has actually been much, much, much worse off. And in the last 5 months since this girl asked that question, they're still worse off now than they were then, but they are much, much worse off since Saddam Hussein died. He killed 1 million of them. He kept them in line. I don't like what I'm saying. If you don't like it, I don't blame you, because I don't either. But Saddam Hussein was liked by a lot of the Iraqis, just like, why was Stalin liked? Because he kept them lined up. He told the bad people, you must get to work, and sent the worst of them off to Siberia, and the rest of them liked it. Some people want law and order. And a classic case is Singapore. Then after this, I'll close. 50 years ago, the people of Singapore could not walk the streets without running a risk of being mugged and waylaid. Then a dictator took over, and he started inflicting firm punishments on the offenders called caning. And one American cane, where they would take a bamboo cane and beat a person on his backside by a martial arts expert. Why did the people of Singapore like this? Because, yeah, you know,
yeah, well, now they're one of the most straight in line.
They don't have any crime anymore. I mean, you know, the bad people either did one of two things. Now, hey, this dictator was one of the best dictators a country could ask for. He killed a few people, but there are only people who deserve to be killed. And the people he beat, they deserve to be beaten. I mean, he only beat a person who had committed a crime. It was not a reign of terror. Before him, there had been a reign of terror. The outlaw could have, the bad people did either one of two things, either changed their ways or left Singapore. And a young American named Michael Fay, who had what we call ADD, attention deficit disorder, went there. He got caned 4 times. He was going to get caned 6, but President Clinton called Lou Yan and said we reduce it. So Lou Yan reduced to 4. Michael Fay got in trouble again in the United States, but he never went back to Singapore. The bad people, you know, some people like the law and order that these strict people give. All right, with that, everybody have a good weekend, and I'll see you Monday. We'll finish China, and we'll start Greece on Monday.